about being introduced by Kendra. She actually does know what I do, so she's not one of these people who has to read. She is, who is she? Thank you very much, Kendra. And I definitely do encourage anybody who is in here who has not yet signed up to receive news about all of our free events, please do so. Kendra has set up all of our material down there. You see the two beautiful purple tables for ACMRS. Also, do please check out the Bagwin historical fiction books there. Who would know about historical fiction as well as Shakespeare? So, let me tell you a little bit how this workshop came to be, because we had a wonderful series earlier on with Margaret, Knapp, and Barbara Acker, and then we dragged another wonderful person by the name of James Wermers into this. And these are all colleagues of ours at the university. We had dealt with Shakespeare from many different angles. And we had also a very successful workshop led by a Brazilian Shakespearean specialist by the name of Chris, who I don't see. I do see her. Hello, Chris. And that's actually where we first met Barbara Acker and Margaret Knapp. And James I had met together with Kendra, and I had met James on an independent visit to the downtown campus. And so we're all talking about Shakespeare. And when it comes time to deal with the anniversary of Shakespeare's death, which I just want to point out to you, is the anniversary of the death of three other great writers that were his exact contemporaries. One, of course, was Miguel de Cervantes, right, the writer of Don Quixote and a lot of other very fine Spanish literature. He also died on April 23rd, 1616. One was El Inca Garcilaso, one of the greatest writers of the colonial period in Latin America, who wrote the royal commentaries of the Incas. He also died in 1616, and another very, very great Andean writer by the name of Juan Poma, who was also a very fine artist. So the two greatest writers of the New World and the two greatest writers of the Old World all died on the same day. Is that really true? No, it's not, because anybody who knows a little bit about early modern history knows that there were adjustments that had to be made between the Julian and the Gregorian calendar. So actually, the day that Cervantes died would have actually been May 4th by the calendar we use now, which don't tell anybody. It sounds good to say they all died on April 23rd, 1616. And then Carrie Wicks Romero, our friend there in the back, without whose help and guidance and invitation, none of these series would be taking place, because it was Carrie who reached out to us at ACMRS, and we're very thankful that she did so. Carrie asked us to plan something on Shakespeare, so since we already had this wonderful kind of Shakespearean reserve group of scholars, we decided to do something with it. And as those of you know who saw the lovely graphic design which Kendra did, do you remember Shakespeare with no face? Yeah, did you look online when you signed up? Or did you see this possibly hanging from a Starbucks bathroom where I also am want to put publicity? Right? This was the publicity for it. Shakespeare with no face. Well, why did Kendra decide to leave out his face? Because our theme here is the ambivalence of Shakespeare. How can we grasp Shakespeare? And so even before we start, I'm saying all this just by way of introduction, and then I will start with my presentation. We will follow that with Margaret Knapp's, and with Barbara Acker's, and we'll end with our friend James Wermer. What I would like to do with you now is once again to read the blurb for our symposium to you so that you can understand what we're dealing with. Ambivalence, the act of not deciding, the act of not having a clear answer, leaving something hanging, possibly deliberately. We speak about his refusal to give us the simplistic answers that later theater and cinema would supply us. So I just want to say by way of warning, do not come to Shakespeare if you want the proverbial totally happy ending, or even in what is probably the most blood-drenched of all of his dramas, Titus Andronicus, when just about everybody has been killed, eaten, or mutilated. Or all three simultaneously, James. This is very true. There is actually still a very strong element of hope. When the two people who haven't been killed, and elderly man and a young boy both walk away from the dinner table together. There is never the cut and dried answers or the cut and dried style of theater we've become more used to, really from 19th century melodrama, and that Hollywood basically throws at you. Whether it is monarchy and the attitude towards divine right versus the people's rights, and the moral depravity evident on both sides, or religious intolerance and stereotyping of the others, when even the bard's most unflinching prejudice opens the door to questioning of those precepts, Shakespeare's ambiguity becomes our own. It's a very well-written blurb, if I do say so myself. And James Constantine, that's why he's wearing a suit. He wanted to sound intelligent for this blurb. He will, don't worry. I can guarantee you that. But we are talking about a time, please remember, of the worst religious intolerance. I've made this point just about every place I've spoken, whether I'm speaking about colonial Latin America or imperial England and Ireland. It is a bit of a misnomer to call this time a Renaissance, although you have some of the greatest Renaissance minds who ever lived. Please remember, as Anthony Burgess points out, this is a period in which we cannot separate the political, the ugly political, as Burgess puts it, from the great artistic creations. And so, Anthony Burgess would remind you, and I will remind you, because if he reminds you to do it, I certainly should. Anthony Burgess, by the way, is one of Shakespeare's greatest biographers. Anthony Burgess asks us to remember that every single play that Shakespeare wrote, he wrote in very fierce competition with another playwright by the name of Christopher Marlowe, who was a good playwright. He is a good playwright, but he certainly does not come up to Shakespeare's level of profound analysis. But at the time, they were commercial rivals. So we cannot divorce the fact that Shakespeare was involved in a neck-and-neck rivalry and confrontation with Marlowe. So Marlowe wrote his rather notorious play, The Jew of Malta, with some fairly revolting anti-Semitic stereotypes. Shakespeare follows that less than a year later with The Merchant of Venice, in which, yes, there are anti-Jewish stereotypes, but perhaps despite himself, and perhaps what I call, that I'm going to quote myself, isn't that egotistical? You know, his most unflinching prejudice, and I'm sure, as a man of his time, Shakespeare was infected by anti-Semitism. Because he was a genius, he could begin to see through it. And so it's a play that ends up questioning anti-Semitism. The same way as Othello, which you can say, to a certain degree, definitely stereotypes the idea of the violent black man. But Shakespeare is such a genius, he ends up seeing through that prejudice as well. Is it they all lived happily ever after? No, it is ambivalence. It remains ambivalence. Shakespeare's ambiguity becomes our own. His difficulty in dealing with these problems are the gateway to the modern world, one in which science and obscurantism collided and continues to collide. So when I wrote that, I was thinking about the 16th century, but of course you can say it now. Of course you can say it now, and therefore we use the term early modern period because those who lived in the 16th century were frightfully conscious that the, I don't want to say universal truths, let me say the more limited truths that they had accepted in the Middle Ages were gone, were no longer valid. It was a time of exploration and brutal conquest. It was a time when many different cultures came into contact with each other in a very ugly way, and that is indeed what the bard shows us. And so when you have Othello choking Desdemona and Iago demonizing Othello, you wouldn't say these are very hopeful signs for racial understanding, but what Shakespeare was showing you, perhaps not even wanting to, was the tragedy which resulted from this collision of worlds in which, frankly, nobody understood anyone else. That theme of other worlds is the time of the New World, the conquest of the Americas. That is everywhere in Shakespeare's plays. And let me point out to you before I begin with the ambivalence Shakespeare had towards power. Let me point out to you that the most important book on Shakespeare, published this past year in 2015, is called Worlds Elsewhere, and I very much recommend this book to you. You do not have to be a Shakespearean scholar, but if you are, you will also find it brilliant. So you can be a complete novice or a Shakespearean scholar. The book is called Worlds Elsewhere, and the quote is from Coriolanus, not The Tempest. And the author is Anthony Dixon. And what Anthony Dixon shows you in this book is how, because of Shakespeare's ambiguity, and so I did steal the idea for this workshop from Anthony Dixon, because of his ambiguity, he has become a universally beloved playwright. So when Romeo and Juliet was performed in 1947, right before the hideous bloodshed that would erupt in India, between India and Pakistan, and Romeo was Muslim and Juliet was Hindu, this play could be translated with no problem, because Shakespeare, at one point in all of his writing, however nasty and imperialist and racist and all those ugly epithets, I guess we can throw it in to a certain degree, it was in the air, it was the way he was brought up, but he always sees through them. And I would say we have very few writers, contemporary writers, who were able to see through their culture and analyze it to the degree that Shakespeare was. Does he come to any conclusions? No, he doesn't. That's exactly the point of the presentation. He remains ambivalent, without a clear decision. I would go so far as to say, yes, that is actually the condition of the modern world, the ambivalence. Even the religious fundamentalism that we see from many religions, to a certain degree, is the response to this ambivalence, which will not go away. We have no cut and dry truths anymore. So let's start with the first one, Shakespeare's ambivalence towards power. Well, I'm going to focus with you on one particular play, which is King Lear. And to understand the ambivalence towards power, let's go back to the origins of the story. Because the story of Lear is an old Irish story. And it's a pre-Christian Irish story. And Lear, of course, is the god of the ocean. And Lear, in that original story, has 3 children. One is called Bran MacLear, who is a giant and fights the people of the goddess Danan. And he carries with himself, it's called the Great Pot of Immortality. And this was a large cauldron by which Bran could revive anyone. And so Bran was the most beloved of Lear's children. Remember this point, because when we deal with Lear and the ambivalence towards power, in Shakespeare, this idea of the most loved child will come back. The second child that Lear had, Manannán, is king of the Isle of Man, and his special gift is that he can make himself invisible to all but his father. And so this gift of the cloak of invisibility makes him the second favored child. Now, if you remember King Lear, and if you haven't read it, please definitely do so. The eldest daughter, Goneril, is of course the first favorite. Then we have the youngest daughter, Regan. And the third daughter, Cordelia, is the one whom Lear dislikes at the beginning because she does not give him the quote-unquote gifts that the other 2 do. In the original Irish story, Lear does indeed have a third child, and that is the one daughter. Her name is Branwen. And Branwen unwittingly becomes the cause of a war between Wales and Ireland, but the story ends with Branwen weeping for her father, the ocean god Lear, who only realizes at the end that Branwen was not the cause of the war, but that rather the other 2 brothers were. Now, that's the original Irish story. It's an Irish and Welsh story. And you can find it in a very early collection of Celtic literature called the Mabinogion. If anybody's looking at King Arthur, that's also one of the oldest Arthurian connections. Did Shakespeare know it? I'm sure he did. People who like to discredit Shakespeare say he plagiarized plots. Of course he did. Everybody did so. It was considered completely acceptable to what we would call plagiarize a plot, because the originality of plot was not a value in the 16th century. Where, of course, nobody can approach Shakespeare is the magnificence of his dialogue. But we can see in that original Irish and Welsh plot that Shakespeare would have known, because Celtic literature and Celtic folklore was a very, very important part of the Elizabethan mindset as well. Shakespeare would have known the story, and no story would have revealed more poignantly the ambivalence towards power. How do we define power? There's a magnificent researcher, also from Brazil. Now you're wondering why I keep on mentioning Brazil, but Brazil, as our friend here, Chris, will tell you, happens to be one of the centers for Shakespearean research and study. And a very fine researcher from Brazil by the name of Christian Dunker has an interesting analysis of Shakespearean power. And I'm going to give that to you now, because I think more than anything, it describes the ambivalence. Dunker says that in Shakespearean plays, the tragedy arises when somebody thinks he has more power than he does. Now let's stay with that thought for a minute, because that's very interesting. If we accept Dunker's theory, and I think it's certainly worth looking at, Shakespeare is essentially saying to us that we are all fairly impotent in terms of the way we can form and mold our fate. Or if not impotent, then at least limited. There are things beyond our control. Now, I know there is a very strong current in American philosophy. It's very interesting for me to see this on both the right and the left wing. Because the right wing has this with American exceptionalism, and the left wing has this with positive projection. So I would like to say to both the right and the left, that Shakespeare would have told you, there are things you cannot control. No matter how exceptional you think you are, and no matter how much positive thought you put towards it. And Shakespeare's tragedies, I think, and on this point I agree very much with Christian Dunker, really do arise from this gruesome miscalculation of power. If I am a king, if I am Lear, I should be omnipotent. There is nothing a king cannot do. There is a great deal that a king cannot do. And Shakespeare, being Shakespeare, would have perceived that in the original Irish folktale. Of course, what he does with it will be even more extraordinary. Well, he changes, of course, the first two sons to daughters. And so Manannán and Bran become Cordelia and Regan, and Branwen becomes Cordelia. And he deals with the issue that Dunker calls the choice of boxes. And again, I'm quoting Dunker because I think he explains this very well. He describes Lear as a child in king's clothing, very interesting description of anyone who considers themselves omnipotent, or whom divine right has declared as omnipotent, faced with three boxes, of course, that of gold, that of silver, that of copper. By the way, you can find that analogy again in Shakespeare and The Merchant of Venice. And to a certain degree, of course, it is Goneril who gives him that golden box, because Goneril's declaration of love for Lear is passionate and effusive, and it's certainly what you want to hear, right? You want to hear, definitely, that you are loved. You want verbalization of it. Regan, to a certain degree, I think, goes one stronger than Goneril, because if you read Regan's declaration of love for her father, it almost seems to insinuate she will place her father above her husband, that her father remains the man in her life. Now, beyond whatever Freud would have done with this, and I'm not sure that we can look at this in a Freudian sense, although, of course, Regan's speech in King Lear has given rise to a lot of Freudian interpretation. I would try to keep this here with the ambivalence of power, because I think that both Regan and Goneril are very aware of the fact that their father is becoming powerless. Cordelia is aware of it as well. And Cordelia is aware, of course, of the one fact that neither Goneril nor Regan will ever emphasize in their discussions with their father. Lear is facing his own mortality. He is facing death. Now, at that moment at which, of course, we are all the most vulnerable, it would help to hear verbalization of love. But for Cordelia, what Goneril and Regan are doing is not a verbalization of love. For Cordelia, what Goneril and Regan are doing is sheer hypocrisy. And so, of course, Her declaration of love to her father is far more muted, and it causes Lear's rage. And now I would ask you, if you look at the question of power, the king as a symbol of absolute power, and it really is, as we get into what some scholars call the Renaissance, and I and other scholars call the early modern period, this is the period when we start to have the massive despotic state. Okay, the most absolute monarch in the Middle Ages was far less absolute, whether we're talking about Western Europe or Peru, okay? It's very interesting that this holds true in both the Old and New Worlds. The most powerful monarch of the Middle Ages was severely limited in comparison to the monarchs of the early modern period. When you have a monarch like Queen Isabella in Spain, like Bloody Mary, or Queen Elizabeth in England, like Philip II in Spain, like Ivan the Terrible in Russia, this is a new period. This is a period of the despotic state. And so the king should be more powerful than ever. Now please remember, Shakespeare, of course, is writing Lear in the early modern period, during the period of the despotic state. And so his insinuation that the king is not so powerful could be a dangerous one. Now here, let's look at something very quickly. Elizabeth herself, the red-haired queen, had to vet everything that he wrote. At the same time, we know that Elizabeth was saddled with somebody she more or less inherited from the previous regime, and her relationship with him was a bit ambivalent, Francis Walsingham, who of course had the title of, anybody know? Chief Spy. Okay? To a certain degree, he's considered, you could say he was the founder of the English Secret Service. And Elizabeth had a very, very ambivalent relationship with him. Very ambivalent. She needed him to find plots that were hatched against her. She also limited his power to persecute English Catholics because she herself did not believe, and she was right in this, that all of England's Catholics were against her. They certainly were not. But there is this ambivalence in terms of the relationship of power that she has to Walsingham, and what Walsingham's very militant agenda is. He has often been called the Protestant Inquisitor. And although he was a Protestant, he used many of the same methods that the Spanish Inquisition used. So this is not an issue of Catholic or Protestant. This is simply an issue of what really are the limitations of the king's power, or the queen's power. Let me add one more thing to this stew before I turn the podium over to Professor Margaret Knapp. Regarding this ambivalence of power, if we look at the scene in Lear, and I think this scene more than any of them, it's in Act 3, it's Act 3, Scene 2, is something which demonstrates not only an ambiguous attitude towards power, but possibly a questioning of the whole idea of divine right, is of course when Lear is wandering alone through the forest after a series of tragic events, and he's led to a certain degree by somebody we might call a holy fool. Has anybody heard that phrase ever used before? And it's actually an earlier trope, an earlier character from medieval French and English and Celtic tradition. A person who is basically, who we would not consider to be learned in the academic sense, but who has a deep wisdom. You find this character appearing in many, many works of the 16th century. Think for a second of Miguel de Cervantes y Saavedra. Think of Don Quixote. Who is Don Quixote really guided by? Because we know Don Quixote is out of his mind. Who leads him? Sancho Panza, exactly. And Sancho appears to be a fool and a buffoon, but we know he's not that much of a fool, and he's not that much of a buffoon. And Lear is led here also by someone who appears to be a fool, and the idea of a king being dependent. Think of this. A king dependent on a fool. What is Shakespeare playing with here? Is he playing with the idea of questioning divine right? Is he playing with, as Anthony Burgess suggests, an earlier medieval idea that Shakespeare himself may have favored, which was the dependence on the court jester? And of course we know that the court jester would be able to say things to the king that no one else could say. That ancient practice you have in medieval Europe, they had it in medieval Mexico. The kings, the Toltec kings, had their holy jesters, the Mayan kings, And the Mayan princes actually had their holy jesters up until the Spanish conquest. So this is a bit of a universal idea. Is it only the fool and the jester who can tell the king the truth? Because, of course, the king has been appointed to his place, or in the case of Elizabeth Tudor, to her place, by divine right, and there can be no questioning of it. And Shakespeare questions it. I think he questions it in practically every single play. But it is in Lear, I think it is the most overt. Precisely because Lear, unlike Macbeth, is a somewhat sympathetic figure. I want to end with one thought. Lear's journey is very different than Odysseus' journey or Ulysses. If you compare Shakespeare to the earlier Greek epics, we see a huge difference in terms of character development. In the Greek epics, the character goes all over the place, but doesn't really change. Okay, Ulysses, after, whether you want to use the Latin or the Greek version, or Odysseus, when he comes back after all those years, he's still, he's still Odysseus, and his dog recognizes him. That must have been the longest lived dog on the planet. So, very healthy dogs in ancient Greece. And Penelope, of course, who's still winding her spindle, she recognizes him. So, in many of the earlier epics of the classic Greco-Roman world, although the character goes everywhere, there's very little internal transformation. And in fact, that's the point, that the person really comes home. Shakespeare, of course, is a man of his time, and his time was a time of questions and uncertainty about everything. How could you not have uncertainty if you had been taught until 1492 that there was no world beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and suddenly every churchman looked like a fool? Okay, and as much as they tried to wind the story of the discovery of the New World around other biblical passages, the fact is it was obvious to everyone that no church had the answer to this new world, and so it created a horrible sense of doubt. What do I believe in? I don't know that Shakespeare was sure about that. When Hamlet speaks of death and doesn't say for sure it's heaven, for sure it's hell, right? To sleep, perchance to dream, he is dealing with a type of existential questioning, which we have to thank Queen Elizabeth for being so liberal that she allowed him to say it. In later epics, and now I'm going to draw a funny conclusion for you, but in many Native American epics, of the Maya, the Popol Vuh, of the ancient Peruvians, the Huarochiri manuscript, the hero goes through a profound internal transformation. And though that hero never goes home, that hero has been changed and learns a greater truth. People, that is what Shakespeare is showing you. So if I've just possibly proved to you that in Shakespeare's ambivalence, Shakespeare is actually closer to a shamanic tradition in which the greatest voyage is inside of yourself, yes, there is something there. As a man of the early modern period, there were no eternal truths anymore. You could not go around the world and come back home because home would not exist. You could go around the world, but you would be different and you would be changed. And so there is no unchanging, immutable power. Power is mutable, and that is the basic message of Lear. Now I have the pleasure of turning this rather loud microphone over to Professor Margaret Knapp from Arizona State University. And just very quickly, I want to point out that Professor Margaret Knapp is Professor Emerita of the School of Film, Dance, and Theater of the ASU Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts. And Margaret is going to speak to you about the way this sense of power has been used, misused, implemented, whatever your political point of view, by the elite. So, Margaret.
4 bottles of water up here. I don't know what that means. Last Saturday, as we all know, was the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. In honor of the occasion, the Folger Shakespeare Library presented forum of important people speaking on their views of Shakespeare. And it was broadcast on C-SPAN 2 at 9 o'clock in the morning out here in Arizona, but it's also archived on C-SPAN 2 if you're interested in seeing it. Before I talk about that, I just want to say something about the Folger Shakespeare Library. Let's see what happens. Henry Clay Folger was a very wealthy man holding high office in the Standard Oil Corporation, which was the infamous oil monopoly established by John D. Rockefeller, who was a very good friend of Folger's. In fact, they played golf together, if you could picture this. Folger and his wife Emily had no children, and their real obsession was in collecting old books from the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods, the periods of Shakespeare. Anything they could find that was old and rare. And they devoted a great deal of their money to this, and they also, when something especially expensive but desirable was on the market, would borrow money from people like Rockefeller to enable them to buy the books. So, after a lifetime of collecting, the Folgers decided that they wanted to build a library where scholars could have access to their work. And after thinking about different places to locate it, they decided on Washington, D.C. This is the library that they finally built, the Folger Shakespeare Library. And let me just show you where it is in Washington. You see the U.S. Capitol building. To the right, the Supreme Court. And below the Supreme Court is the Jefferson Building, which is the original Library of Congress building. Behind it is the Adams Building, which is the Library of Congress building. And just north of that is the Folger Shakespeare Library. So it is in the heart of our government that the Folger Library was built. I had the privilege of spending a summer at a Shakespeare Institute at the Folger Shakespeare Library. And I remember so well both the sight of all these old books, and maybe more importantly, or more long-lasting, was the smell of all those old books. And you know what I'm talking about if you're a book lover. So the main reading room, and this is kind of a fisheye view, is a long, narrow room with a beautiful stained glass window up at the top there. And old desks, and the decor is kind of what we might call Renaissance Revival or an ersatz Elizabethan or something of that sort. One of my fondest memories of working at the Folger was that mostly it was inhabited by individual scholars working alone. I remember one woman, a friend of mine, was working on the diaries of Elizabeth Inchbald, who was an 18th century actress and playwright. And the diary books were about this big, and the handwriting was correspondingly tiny. So she was sitting there all day long, and the Folger gives you some sponge supports so you don't crack the bindings of the books. Sitting there trying to read with a magnifying glass these diaries. So it's in many ways a very lonely occupation. But at 3 o'clock or 3:30, I forget now, everything stops, you go downstairs and have tea. So for old fogies like me, this is heaven on earth. Old books and tea, what more could you want? So the broadcast last Sunday was called The Wonder of Will, Sharing Shakespeare Stories. And it was held in the reading room, and rows of chairs were set up, the tables were removed, and rows of chairs were set up. And one by one, important people got up and talked, mostly important people got up and talked about what Shakespeare meant to them, or their connection with Shakespeare. Among the presenters were Stephen Breyer, who's a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, right around the corner from the Folger. Jane Chu, chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. William Adams, chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Kaya Hardison, chancellor of the Washington, D.C. School District. Donna Denitze, chair of English at the St. Albans School for Boys in Washington, D.C., private school. Francisca Piantini, a student from the DC school district who had been given a scholarship by the Folger to come and work in programs with them. Clarence Page, a syndicated newspaper columnist for the Chicago Tribune. Ellen Mackay, a professor at Indiana University. Carolyn Clay, a DC professional actress. Actor Cal Penn, playwright Octavio Solis, and for good measure, 2 performers from the Reduced Shakespeare Company. They're the people who do that, all of Shakespeare's plays abridged in one performance. There's obviously a practical reason for concentrating on people in the DC area, probably the cost of airfare and hotels. But I find it intriguing to look at the interweaving of government, including heads of the NEA and NEH, institutions that have funded Folger Shakespeare Library projects in the past, and also the judge from the highest court in the land, and also educational institutions from K-12 through university. So, although the Folger does not receive direct government support, it's not a government institution, it's private, it has its tentacles reaching out into all of these other institutions of government, education, and the like. So what does this program have to do with Shakespearean ambivalence? Well, mainly it's because Sharonah came up with this title about ambivalence. And I'm to be a little honest here. One of the common threads in the speeches was the characterization of Shakespeare as an immortal, universal genius, whose work is as profound and meaningful today as it was when it was first written. And we've all heard that about Shakespeare. Those of us who know and love Shakespeare's work sometimes think he is addressing us directly, either personally or as a culture. What we don't often stop to realize is that there is a complex network of institutions that constantly shape and reshape our perceptions of Shakespeare, choosing elements from the rich and complex variety of his work that in some way serve our society in a particular moment. It is easy to see how this worked in the past. For example, in the late 18th through the 19th century, British society believed that works of theater or literature should promote strong moral values, the melodrama that Sharonah was referring to. And so we had such phenomena as Thomas Butler, who edited Shakespeare's plays for the family Shakespeare that he published, taking out all of the little naughty bits and making it possible for children and families together to read the plays. And in the theater, the plays were made to conform to the notion of poetic justice. And poetic justice is the notion that no character should be rewarded in excess of their virtue or punished in excess of their vice. So in other words, everybody should get what they deserve on the basis of their moral probity or lack thereof. So when it came to performing Shakespeare, following that precept, innocent characters like Romeo and Juliet and Cordelia were made to live at the end of the plays. And in fact, Cordelia winds up married to Edgar, who's the survivor, the good son of the Duke of Gloucester in King Lear. In the Romantic era of the 19th century in Europe and America, people were focused on the idea of the romantic hero, someone who is in opposition to the society in which he lives and suffers accordingly. So we have Lord Byron as kind of the living epitome of that. Also such fictional characters as Goethe's Werther. In the 1960s, so Hamlet then becomes the focus character of the romantic hero. And all of the political parts of Hamlet are removed so that we don't worry about Fortinbras or who's going to rule in Denmark. The focus is on this tragic hero who is so at odds with his world. In the 1960s, when the theater was full of existential and absurdist drama, King Lear, with its despairing line, quote, "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they pluck us for their sport," that became the hallmark of performances of King Lear that were in the style of Beckett or Ionesco, exploring existential or absurdist themes in a kind of blank and harsh world. During America's imperialistic period after the Spanish-American War, the play The Tempest was viewed as justifying the virtues of America's new involvement in world conquest. While in more recent decades, The Tempest has been directed as an expose of the evils of colonization. So it's functioned both ways within a century. My point is that the image of Shakespeare himself, as well as his works, is constantly being reinvented by different cultures to serve the needs of the moment. And among the institutions most capable of that kind of reinvention are the schools and the theater, the latter expanding to include film, video, and social media. So we should think of the process by which he approached Shakespeare himself as a cultural icon, as well as his works as one of interaction, whereby we bring a previously obtained sense of who he is and what his works are about, a sense to a great degree formed in us by cultural institutions such as the schools. Wearing the lenses that we've been given by these institutions, it's no wonder that we see what we have been led to see. This is not to say that we cannot have unique experiences of Shakespeare. We all find things in the works that we need to find, and often we change our evaluations of Shakespeare as we get older. When I was in college, I thought that King Lear's two daughters, Regan and Goneril, were pure evil. But in my middle years, when I had to deal with the not always sensible wishes and behaviors of my own aging father, I recognized what the girls were going through and pitied them to some extent. I used to say, you won't hear me say a bad word about those girls. It is the very richness and ambiguity of the works that enables the cultures of many times and places to make use of his words and ideas, to justify the status quo, or to help whip up a rebellion. So now I'd like to present a kind of case study of how Shakespeare can be made to speak for specific purposes. This is a map of where the theaters were in Shakespeare's own time. And you'll notice that they were built on the outskirts of London. So up here are the first two theaters. And then in later years, theaters were built down on the south bank of the Thames, the area called Bankside. The reason that the theaters were built in these areas, which are called liberties, is that although the monarchy liked theater, Elizabeth and James and James's son Charles all supported theater and had theater performances brought to court, the people who ran the city of London were primarily puritanical and thought the theater was a tool of the devil. And so they wanted no part of the theater in the city of London. And the ancient city of London is the area that was inside the walls of the city. So if you see that line goes here. From the Tower of London over, that's the walls of the ancient city. And you can still see a little bit of those walls at the Museum of London. So within those walls, there is to be no theater by decree of the mayor and the council. So the theater people moved out to the outskirts. Besides theater, the south bank of the Thames was a home to brothels, taverns, and animal baiting arenas, all also condemned by the Puritan preachers and lay people. Some theaters were built directly north or east of the city, and a couple of indoor theaters appeared in smaller liberties within the boundaries of the city. But it's important to note that all of these theaters were not operating at the same time. In fact, the average was probably 3 or maybe at the most for a couple of years, 4 theaters being used at once. The Puritans eventually came to dominance in the British Parliament, and in 1642 began a civil war against the forces of the king. The parliamentary forces defeated the king's army and captured the king in 1648. The following year, King Charles I was beheaded, and England became a commonwealth ruled by a parliament under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. It was during this period that the few remaining theaters were closed down and mostly demolished. So from then on, there were no more material remains of the theater buildings. For the next century scholars at the end of the 18th century, who were the first to take an interest in the conditions under which the plays are actually performed, to examine them. So there was nothing left. And that was the case indeed until 1989, when an office building in Southwark, which is the large area from Bankside south in London, an office building was being demolished to make way for another office building. And according to British law, when that happens, the builders have to allow archaeologists to examine the excavation for any important historical artifacts. What they found astounded the archaeological world, and indeed most of the British public, for there were the remains of part of the foundation of the Rose Theatre. Those white square things are the foundations from the office building that was torn down. So what you can see is the stage, the back facade, and some of the shape of the auditorium. And they found all kinds of things on the ground that people had dropped and fun stuff like that. So this is what they discovered. Immediately, there was a movement to save the excavations and to be able to study them, for people to see them. And the movement was headed by just about every distinguished actor and actress from the British stage. Several plans were put forth, but in the end, the foundations were covered in sand with the rather dubious explanation that they would therefore be safe until future archaeologists would come up with a plan to save them. Work on the new office building resumed, and today you can go into the basement of that office building and see, it's unbelievable, outlined by lights on top of the water that had seeped in because it's a very low water table, high water table in that area, the shape of the rooms. Why was the campaign for the Rose a failure? As usual, the various agendas of government agencies, cultural organizations, and developers clashed over whether to save the rooms, and if so, how best to preserve and exhibit them. One vote against exhibiting them came from Sam Wanamaker, say that again, an American expatriate actor in London, whose ambition was to build a replica of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre as close as possible to the site of the original, or at least the second Globe, built in 1614. Wanamaker had been fundraising for the project for many years. I remember getting an invitation to a polo match in Florida that Prince Charles was going to take part in as a fundraiser, so you could see where they thought the money might come from, US of A. So Wanamaker was worried about the attention being drawn away from his globe toward the foundations of the Rose. After the Rose furor died down, the new Globe Theatre was built and has been presenting plays by Shakespeare and his contemporaries ever since. The scholars who contributed to the design of this new globe took the information gleaned from the Rose into consideration in helping to draw up the plans for the new theatre. The press, both British and American, under the guise of reporting the Rose story, actually contributed to creating the public's understanding of the importance of the excavation. In order to see what was going on in the press, we need to look first at a highly debated illustration published by a Dutchman, Wenceslaus Haller, in 1644, but based on sketches he had made years earlier and completed when he was in exile in Holland. This is Holler's engraving. But added to it are two more theaters. In Holler's engraving, there is the globe, which had written on it bear baiting, because Holler confused the two, and the hope, which had written on it the globe. No other theaters were in his drawing. So by the 1640s, when he published his drawing, there were only those two theaters, which he confused. So when the London Times published it, they added two theaters, maybe innocently or maybe with a hidden purpose. The headline, as you can see, is "Race to Save the Cradle of Theater." And the caption reads, quote, 17th century engraving of Bankside, once London's theaterland, as it was in about 1660, with the four playhouses of Shakespeare's day superimposed. Now keep in mind that all four of these theaters did not operate at the same time. By the time of Holler's engraving, the Swan had not been used much after 1601, and there is no evidence of performances at the Rose after 1605. And in fact, both had probably been demolished by then at the time of the engraving, otherwise they would have shown up in the picture. Superimposing two more theaters on the Holler engraving enables the paper to call the Southwark area a theaterland, a term which has a special meaning for Londoners. Today, the area we call London's West End, where all of the theaters are, is also called Theaterland. As you can see on this map, the label up at the top left corner is Theaterland, and those are today's theaters. Also, the signs high up on buildings in London that tell you what neighborhood you're in, as well as the street. The streets in the West End area are called Theaterland. So, why use a contemporary designation for a district in the West End to label a picture of superimposed theaters in Shakespeare's day? At the time the article appeared, the Bankside area was being developed as a tourist destination, with the already existing Festival Hall, British Film Institute, and National Theatre of Great Britain, soon to be joined by the Tate Modern Gallery, which was in a renovated power plant, the London Eye Ferris wheel, and the Millennium Bridge. All of that on the Bankside of the Thames as it curves south. Asserting that the Bankside area was once a cradle of theater, even though the cradle was carefully constructed by the Times staff, justifies the seeming renaissance for Bankside, even though you can't have a renaissance or rebirth unless you first have a naissance or birth. So, presenting it as a renaissance on the basis of a fictitious picture presents a fictional past that makes possible, even necessary, a rebirth of the area as a cultural tourist mecca. Who could object to such a seemingly positive spin on the development of the Bankside as a tourist area? The answer is the current residents of the southern, south of Bankside. So the people who live this way and going south. Once you get away from the tourist area, most of the other parts of Southwark are dominated by immigrant and working class inhabitants. In 1993, a writer asserted that today North Southwark tops the list for inner city deprivation. The Southwark Council was largely unsuccessful in providing the kinds of services its residents required. What the people of North Southwark really needed was a new community center to provide those services and to be a place where the people could meet and exchange ideas and views. Instead, they got the New Globe Theatre. So creating a cradle of theatre exaggerates and romanticizes the history of Bankside, which then plays into the hands of the wealthy aristocratic class that tries to assert its hereditary privileges in the face of an ever more diversifying population, as well into the hands of developers whose properties will benefit from the increased value of the Bankside area. And Shakespeare's position as a cultural icon, as the cultural icon, makes all of this possible. The day after this article appeared in the Times of London, this is the New York Times. The New York Times picked up the story and illustration, cutting out the hope, probably because of space requirements, but keeping the superimposed rows. Their caption read, "The Rose Theatre, along with the Globe and the Swan, are shown in a detail of Pollard's 17th century engraving of London's Bankside section." Less interested in creating a cradle of theater, the New York Times characterized the story as a mystery or a treasure hunt. Further obscuring the story, the Times article claimed that there was a slight chance that the rose foundations were actually those of a bear baiting arena, adding a layer of utter confusion to the meaning of the illustration and of the excavation of the rose. Last Saturday, after I watched the C-SPAN broadcast, I looked at my email and I found that my niece had sent me a picture of her daughter, my grandniece, in a play at school. The name of the play was Jitterbug Juliet, a musical set in the 1940s where two families are fighting over whose show will be presented at the community center. The Montagues are planning a jitterbug dance contest, while the Capulets want to use the center at the same time for a performance of Romeo and Juliet. Needless to say, this play for children, everything works out in the end. In this version, nothing remains of Shakespeare's original play but a few plot lines, but it's interesting that even in this watered-down and transposed children's play, the notion that performing Shakespeare is a valid and important thing to do still lives on. And it is our schools, as well as our libraries and theaters and mass media, that such notions are constantly reinvented. All in all, what a Saturday it was. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And I'd now like to take us from this wonderful analysis of elitism and politics to the actual issue of the stage itself. So I would like to present you to Professor Barbara Acker, also Professor Emerita of the School of Film, Dance, and Theater of the ASU Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts. And Barbara is going to take us to the stuff of theater itself.
Thank you so much. My background is in performance, so I have acted in Shakespearean and Jacobean drama, coached it, taught it. So I am fascinated with how the ambiguities and ambivalences of his text give a wonderful gift to both the actor and the director. Because you have to make some kind of sense of a story. And when it seems confusing because of the ambiguity, you must make some choices. For the ambivalence, the stories that seem unpalatable, unsatisfactory, the characters you don't like, you need to make some choices to make it more palatable. After all, if your audience hates the show, they'll get up and leave. The show closes, and so ends a great commercial enterprise. So actors and directors love it. Shakespeare has rich, complex characters, struggles over power are everywhere. The contradictions and the unlikable parts of the narrative are simply challenges to find a way through the story, a slant on the story that makes it comprehensible and palatable. You need to create a world in which your interpretation makes sense. And I am simply talking about those interpretations that are trying to make sense of the text itself and not those that put, let's say, measure for measure on Mars just for the sake of a fun set and costumes. So, I want to talk first of all about the kinds of tensions and conflicts that actors exploit to the hilt. And I'm going to turn to Henry V. If Henry, the king who is fighting in France, can, on his horse or standing on foot, say in front of the gates of the city of Harfleur, which they are besieging, "I will not leave the half-achieved Harfleur till in her ashes she lies buried. The gates of mercy shall all be shut up, and the fleshed soldier, rough and hard of heart, in liberty of bloody hand, shall range with conscience wide as hell, mowing like grass your fresh, fair virgins and your flowering infants." A man who can say this to a town he would like to pillage, is he admirable enough to be the hero? How do you deal with this ambivalence that this soldier general arouses in an audience? Well, for Laurence Olivier, in his 1944 film that he adapted the script, directed the script, and starred in, he spoke those lines because the threats were necessary in a war to defeat an overwhelming enemy. The film, after all, was dedicated to the commandos and airborne troops of Great Britain, in the spirit of whose ancestors it has been humbly attempted to recapture. The necessity in part sanitized the brutality of the film and this besieging, so the whole film could be a morale booster for an audience still in the middle of World War II, still frightened that Hitler was going to show up somewhere on the Dover coast. Look now at a different interpretation of Henry the Fawn. This is Kenneth Branagh's, well, first I'm going to talk about his 1984 Stratford production, which was, in a sense, his preparation for doing his own film. Well, when he first tackled the script, he and his director, Adrian Noble, decided, and these are the words of Kenneth Branagh, the many paradoxes in the character should be explored as fully as possible, but we shouldn't try to explain them. I made clear my firm belief in the genuine nature of Henry's humility and piety. I also agree that the man who threatened such violence before the gates of Harfleur was a professional killer of chilling ruthlessness. He was working in a post-Falkland War Britain, so his play version was also dirty, murderous, and a story that war is hell. When he went on to adapt, direct, and star in his own film version of Henry V, the image of war is a dirty business and may not be morally right in all situations still holds true. Actors may be excited by the challenges of interpreting ambiguity and ambivalence, but they're going to have to make some decisions. You cannot tell an audience, "Lord, I love you. Lord, I love you. Lord, I love you." And then say to the audience, "Well, you choose the version you like best out of these lines." Let's take for a moment that wonderful scene in Hamlet. Hamlet has gone to his mother. It's called the closet scene. And he is convincing her that her then husband, Claudius, has murdered Hamlet's father to seize the throne and to marry her, Gertrude. He hears a noise behind the arras. He stabs with his sword and pulls out the dead Polonius, thinking it's the king, that he's killed the King Claudius, which is his job in the play to do. This is a revenge play, so he has to kill Claudius. The queen is frightened to death. She says, "Oh, what a rash and bloody deed is this?" Hamlet replies, "A bloody deed. Almost as bad, good mother, as to kill a king and marry with his brother." Queen, "As kill a king?" Hamlet, "Aye, lady, it was my word." Well, does Gertrude in that horrible moment, accept the fact that Hamlet is telling the truth and that Claudius murdered her husband? Does she then follow her son's orders to the letter and stay away from Claudius? Does she, this could be another way of playing this moment, this line is Killer King, does she realize that she has always known very deep down that of course Claudius has murdered her then husband to seize the throne and to marry her? Is she suddenly filled with grief, remorse? Does she feel shame, guilt? Or she can play this another way. She can reject Hamlet's wild accusation. She sees a dead body of Polonius in front of her. Does she believe, I better play along with this madman or he'll kill me too? And sort of then obey all his orders because she's so frightened of it. Well, let's look at this Gertrude. And this Gertrude played the shame and guilt. This is Imogen Stubbs as Gertrude in Trevor Nunn's modern dress production of Hamlet at the Old Vic in 2004. Trevor, the director, chose Stubbs because she was young. He wanted a young Hamlet. He wanted the young Hamlet to have a young mother. So she decided, all right, I'll play a yummy mummy, a British term, meaning somebody who's still sexually alluring, still alive, still has youthful spirits and enthusiasm. And she wants to be more of a friend to her child than a parent. She even wants to go shopping for a trousseau with Ophelia. Well, as an actress, Imogen had always had a little trouble with the relationship between Hamlet, his mother, his stepfather, his father. It didn't make plausible sense in some ways, especially the way he attacks her in this closet scene. It seemed too grand opera to her and not make sense in the same way that some grand opera doesn't. Why are you still so obsessed with your mother, I wanted to ask the Hamlet. Especially, Imogen says, when Gertrude so often has been portrayed as a dignified empress talking to a grown-up actor who has suddenly started acting like a little child, as if the closet scene is based on Psycho. I mean, what's the threat, she says. Why is this 40-year-old still obsessed with his 60-year-old mother getting remarried? So, she's young, her Hamlet is young. So she doesn't have that problem. But how does she play the realization? Well, she plays it as though she has always known deep down that her husband, Claudius, has killed her former husband. Here in this moment, after Hamlet has left her and the king comes in to interrogate her, she says, "Oh my good Lord, what I have seen tonight." She is still shaken. This is Kenneth Branagh's version of Hamlet. He adapted it, directed it, and starred in it in the 1996 version. In fact, the script was so long, almost unabridged, that it ran for over 4 hours. His mother is Julie Christie. She's older than he is, by a little bit at least. And they played the the son and mother scene as if she is frightened in a totally new realization. Here, he is just asking her, how can you turn from my father to this horrible man? So, the meanings that directors and actors agree on have to be a conversation with the script, with each other, and with the audience's cultural values and experiences. This is a very deep negotiation, a trying out of different solutions. And Problem plays that I want to talk about next offer a wonderful opportunity of a window into this negotiation between script actors and directors. Problem plays are filled with ambiguities and ambivalences. And actors and directors spend enormous time and imaginative energy hammering out, why do you say this? Why do you do this? How can I logically get from this to what I do in the next scene? What happens off stage? They need to justify and explain their actions in words. They are not depending on psychological motivations or looking for consistency, but they have to find a world and a concept in which all of the actions of the play will make some kind of sense. And the problem plays are just ripe with all those opportunities to make choices. Let me say a few words about problem plays before I discuss the problem play measure for measure. Problem plays are usually more of a problem for the critic than the actors and the audiences. Actors love solving the problems. Audiences can go along with the interpretations as long as they see something that is consistent with their present values. If you have someone being raped, but we don't use the word rape, and it all seems to end fine because everybody gets married, then the bad thing didn't happen and we can brush that under the carpet and go along, and the comedy stays a comedy. Well, problem plays are not simply stories of good triumphing over evil. There are many shades of gray, and flawed characters can do both good and bad things. Threats are real, and the potential for tragedy hovers over the play the entire time. Endings are ambiguous and unsatisfactory, very often. The audience may scratch its head over the ending, or they may decide, you didn't make a clear choice. Do they get married or not? And it's the open ending that sometimes drives audiences crazy. Let me give you an example from step out of Shakespeare into the world of Ibsen for a moment. There is an Ibsen play in which the mother has been given some poison, and she gets to administer it to her son Oswald because he knows he's descending into an illness of madness. The playwright leaves her, after the son has begged it, mother, I've gone crazy. She knows that. She has the poison, and the hurt goes down. So actresses for so many years threw the poison away to make sure the audience knows that her son is safe. Okay, so measure for measure is a very complicated play, problem play, that has been ignored, castigated, and embraced, depending on the times and the audiences. It arouses so many ambivalent feelings because some of the characters do some very unkind things. Let me review the plot very quickly. The lowlifes, subplot people or prostitutes and thieves, their story intertwines with the main plot. Vincenzio, the Duke of Venice, offers no explanation. He just, in Act 1, Scene 1, abandons Vienna and its rule to his deputy, Angelo. Angelo has Isabella's brother, Claudio, arrested on a charge of fornication for getting his fiancée pregnant. This, then, fornication is punishable by death. Claudio sends his libertine friend Lucio to Isabella, the sister of Claudio, to intercede with Angelo. In Scene 3, the Duke explains himself, but only in private and in such a way that his motives grow even less clear. He's opted out of government, he says, because his city is ungovernable. He's let the law slip so long that liberty plucks justice by the nose. Anarchy threatens. Angelo is a man so cold, they say, that his urine is congealed ice. He's equipped to clear up this urban crisis. The Duke is going to leave the job to him, but the Duke doesn't leave Vienna. He simply disguises himself as friar so he will have access to the private lives of his subjects. And he's very intent on studying and testing Angelo. How will he, Angelo, handle his authority? This outward-seeming deputy he seems to be. Isabella, who's being asked to plead for her brother's life, has just entered the very strict Catholic order of the Sisters of St. Clare. Well, when this young postulate leaves the convent and goes to see Angelo and plead for her brother's life, of course the inevitable happens. He falls for her. He says, "If you will sleep with me, I will spare your brother." Well, she's horrified and threatens to tell the world of his offer to rape her. Ha! Little honor to be much believed in, most pernicious purpose, seeming. I will proclaim thee, Angelo, look for it. Sign me a present pardon for my brother, or with an outstretched stroke I'll tell the world what sort of man thou art. What does Angelo say? Who will believe thee, Isabella? This could be any sexual harassment lawsuit in the universe. Well, eternal damnation is too great a price to pay, and she will not do it. Her brother despairs. Angelo sleeps with someone that he thinks is Isabella, but the Duke has made a substitution. The old fiancé of Angelo has been slipped in, and now Angelo should grant a pardon, he doesn't. So it's a very sad ending there, but the Duke fixes everything up. Everybody lives happily ever after in Act 5. So the Duke marries off Angelo and his former fiancée, Mariana. He has saved Claudio's life by magic, and he lets Claudio marry his fiancée, and then he offers his hand to Isabella. Well, the problems of this play for a modern audience are, gee, the Duke seems to be a terrible manipulator. Is this an abuse of absolute power? He sidestepped his responsibilities for a sort of enforcing the law. He gives it to somebody else, and that somebody else really makes even worse mess. Then he goes around and, like a puppet master, arranges lives at the very end. So there's Measure for Measure. And there's Mark Rylance. He chose a different route. The way to take the curse off the Duke, he believed, was to just play it for laughs. So this was a comedy. And let's see what was said about that. The comedy aims, okay, one of the Guardian critics said Rylance was a limping, stumbling, bungling buffoon who almost faints at the sight of blood. So that was a way, at least some of the audience liked the fact that, well, this has been changed from a world of potential threats to a world of absolute comedy. This would, of course, not please the original viewer of this play. 1604, the play was presented to the then James I, who'd been on the throne only a year and 9 months. He was an absolute authoritarian and believed in the divine right of kings. You can imagine the interpretation for him was, the Duke is right. Oh, I keep doing the wrong thing. Here is Mark Rylance being a bumbling, stumbling fool getting out of the basket. And this is a different take on the Duke. This is Roger Allen in Nicholas Heitner's Measure for Measure in 1987. Isabella is Josette Simon. He played the Duke so tender-hearted that he couldn't impose himself on people. He hesitated. He said things tentatively. Here he is saying, give me your hand and say, you will be mine. And he asks her again, excuse me, I stammered hesitantly on the first line. And Josette looked at me in disbelief. What a crass timing for the Duke. It got a wonderful laugh on, but I'll talk to you about at a fitter time. I was trying to show the Duke's realization of the anguish and pain he's put Isabella through. Yes, again, dear Isabella, I have emotion much imports your good. Whereto, if you will lend a willing ear, what's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. The last big final if. Josette gives me an appraising stare, but doesn't consent. In our production, we tried to show this open, unresolved ending by putting a wordless coda after the text. In the set, huge city gates have been drawn up to reveal a kind of idyllic, pastoral, never-never land beyond. Isabella goes toward the pastoral scene at the back, stops, and turns toward the city and the Duke as the lights go down. People often used to ask me, Roger, Alan, whether they married or not, annoyed at our denying them a happy ending, or suspicious of being overly optimistic. We thought probably they did, but only after a very long conversation. So, thank you very much.
We've heard three wonderful presentations. You're about to hear a fourth. I would like to present you to my friend and colleague, Dr. James Wermers, who is the course manager for Digital Humanities, who's doing very interesting things in terms of digitizing classical literature at the ASU College of Letters and Sciences on our downtown campus. And James is going to take us back to the gritty human reality of Shakespeare's ambivalences.
So walking up here, I can't help but think of the wedding at Cana and the advice the waiter gives, saying, you saved the good wine for last. That's backwards, you've gotten it wrong. I think you've taken the advice too literally and put the good wine first. And so I think maybe to soften the crowd up, the way to begin is with a knock-knock joke, right? So knock-knock. Good, you're all still late. The Earl of Oxford.
Earl of Oxford who?
Exactly. I'll come back to that at the end. So it's a curious thing about Shakespeare. History, chance, and no shortage of unique wit have enshrined him as the great poet of the Western world. The chief canonized saint of our literary tradition, Shakespeare has become a marker, if not the marker, of artistic and intellectual value. To link an idea, or even simply to turn a phrase to the great bard of Avon, is to draw on a bank of cultural currency. Given this, it's no surprise that critics of all stripes have long turned to Shakespeare to justify the value of their own unique religious beliefs. I promise you this. Whether it was, as Herbert Butterfield observed in the early part of the 20th century, the Shakespeare of the Whiggish tradition, or the Shakespeare come crypto-Catholic we see in the work of critics steeped in a desire for apologetics in the middle of the 20th century, Shakespeare has been made to stand for manifold doctrines and beliefs. Even just this past weekend, on the 400th anniversary of William Shakespeare's death, one could find an explosion of articles on Shakespeare claiming him for nearly every tradition. Glancing at the various headlines around the world, we could see extolled Shakespeare the Protestant, Shakespeare the Catholic, Shakespeare the secret Jew, or even Shakespeare the atheist. In short, we want to believe that Shakespeare believed, or perhaps more honestly and pointedly, we very often want to believe that Shakespeare believed what we believe. Well, the ongoing debate about Shakespeare's religious beliefs remains an animated one in many circles. It seems to be slowly moving into the inauspicious territory long slowly occupied by fringe groups. Despite continued popular interest in making Shakespeare the example par excellence of any number of religious traditions, scholars have, as David Scott Caston notes, more and more viewed such claims with the same kind of skepticism that has long been reserved for those like the Exfordians. Increasingly, critics are coming to the conclusion that the search for Shakespeare's religious beliefs might well be simply a waste of our time. put this another way, there's a growing interest in seeing Shakespeare not as an advocate for discernible positions, but as someone deeply ambivalent about traditions he was once marshaled to support. Well, for many modern readers, Shakespeare is still often regarded as the great poet of the English language, the bard of Avon, the swan of Avon, and regarded as the ground on which to plant the flag of their own ideological causes. More recently, there's been a tendency to think of Shakespeare as an artist trying to make a living in the often cutthroat world of the Elizabethan theater, where generations of scholars have looked to Shakespeare to take a position on any number of issues. Was he a feminist, an anti-feminist? Where did he stand on issues of race? It's increasingly common to see Shakespeare as, in the words of Hamlet, a brief and abstract chronicle of his time. And following Hamlet's exhortation, my aim this evening is to see that Shakespeare is well used in this light. Viewed this way, reading, or hopefully watching Shakespeare, becomes a look at his willingness to engage with the tastes and attitudes of the audiences of the Elizabethan theater for whom he was writing. And if we read Shakespeare's creation of religious others in his early plays against this background, as I'm suggesting we might want to do tonight, we find not a Shakespeare of one doctrine or another, but a Shakespeare of ambivalence. A Shakespeare seemingly anxious to engage the issues of the day, but far too crafty to be pinned down to one position or another. In other words, we find Shakespeare to be an author willing to cater to reductive xenophobia, all too often found in his audiences, at a time of acute epistemological turmoil, while at the same time seeming to excoriate the logic of such thinking. Now, before turning explicitly to the plays, I want to spend a few moments sketching out an important political and social issue that I think is at the heart of much of Shakespeare's writing in the 1590s. That is the time at which Shakespeare was writing and producing his earliest plays. In 1594, a Jesuit priest living in exile, most likely Robert Parsons, but possibly William Allen, published a book titled A Conference About the Next Succession of the Crown of England. In this book, two fictitious lawyers, one a supposed expert in English civil law, and the other a supposed expert in English common law, conference about the various potential claimants to the Crown of England. As these two lawyers note in the process of their discussion, there is not one individual who has a singularly clear or powerful claim to the throne. Rather, there are at least 11, if not 14 individuals who could make a legitimate claim, and it seems that each might have been more unsavory than the last in the eyes of English contemporaries. Now, we need to bear in mind that even in the best of times, the succession of English monarchs was, to borrow a phrase from Shakespeare's Macbeth, bloody business. From the forced abdication of Edward II to the overthrow of Richard II by Henry Bolingbroke, English history is full of stories of the intrigue of monarchical politics. Even when there was seemingly a clear heir to the throne, as there was when Edward III succeeded his father Edward II, the machinations of succession were often enough to shock the most ardent Machiavel. And if you're interested in these kinds of machinations, and of course you are, you're here on Wednesday night, you might well enjoy Christopher Marlowe's take on all of this in Edward II. Just, don't eat before the 5th act. At the end of the 16th century, and more importantly in the twilight of the Tudor dynasty, the issue of succession was all the more problematic. From 1558 until Parsons published his book in 1594, England had enjoyed the relative stability of a single monarch. For much of Elizabeth I's reign, England had avoided much of the political and religious tumult that had marred the reigns of her siblings Edward and Mary, a period of English history in which, as Brad Gregory and Anne Dillon have noted, public execution for heresy was a favorite popular pastime. Where the reigns of Edward and Mary had been marked by extremist religious rhetorics and policies, backed all too often by the censure of Tyburn, Elizabeth had generally been happy to stick with the rubric of outward conformity, not all that dissimilar from her father's call for a third way. Ostensibly proto-Anglican, under Elizabeth, England nonetheless maintained a strong Catholic presence that was, more often than not, more or less tolerated. And I sort of, want to stress that it wasn't idyllic, it wasn't great, but hey, at least it wasn't 1556 anymore. While things had been relatively secure in England under Elizabeth, there was reason to be concerned as the new century crept closer. Already nearing 60 as the 1590s began, it was long since clear that the childless Elizabeth was not going to produce a legitimate heir to the throne. And, given the difficulty of succession in the most ideal circumstances, coupled, of course, with an ever-present threat of foreign invasion by Catholics and the specter of the Turks, This meant a future that was at best uncertain, and at worst might spell doom for the English nation. If Elizabeth was succeeded by a Catholic king, and there were a number with a strong claim to the throne, not the least of whom was Philip II, then the nation might fall into the infighting and self-destructive tendencies that had marked the rule of her siblings. Worse still, if Elizabeth were to be succeeded by an ineffective king, the nation might fall entirely. It's here, armed with this understanding of Shakespeare's England, that I'd like to turn to one of his most challenging plays, 1 Henry VI, to investigate in more detail how Shakespeare engaged the theater, not as a place to make claims, but maybe to destabilize them. How Shakespeare was more often ambivalent than he was ideological. Now, 1 Henry VI is the Shakespeare play which most Shakespeareans seem to want to apologize for. Likely written sometime after the failed invasion of the Spanish Armada in 1588 and first performed in 1591, 1 Henry VI is a history play that recounts the English struggle against French armies led by Joan of Arc here, and the dawn of the War of the Roses. The play does have a very different feel than many later plays by Shakespeare, and is decidedly less polished than later history plays like Henry V. Further, given that the play was likely the collaboration of a number of authors, a practice not as unusual as some modern audiences want to imagine, the play sometimes feels uneven. For many critics, this unevenness of the play, especially that of the central antagonist, Joan, is evidence that the play is, to put it very plainly, bad. Only Titus Andronicus gets sort of more vile responses. The unevenness of Joan has been a point of particular interest for critics of Shakespeare. Joan is very clearly an antagonist to the valiant English hero Talbot from the outset of the play. However, where Joan is generally treated as a worthy enemy early in the play, she's even called an Amazon, which is a term that was often used to describe Elizabeth I herself. In Act 5, this changes dramatically. Here, Joan ceases to be merely a martial foe and morphs into a witch in league with demons and a hell-bent on the destruction of the English nation. In the process, the once strong and single-minded Joan is revealed to be a deceptive whore, all too willing to do anything, to tell any lie, to hold on to her life and her chance to regain power. This shift in Joan's character has been a point of contention for many critics, and traditionally it's been cited as evidence the play suffers from a crippling lack of coherence, evidence that Shakespeare and his collaborators lost focus and failed to create a character that was consistent or believable. More recently, critics like Gabriel Jackson have argued that this desire for unity of character might be out of place in the play like Henry. To judge the play as bad because Joan does not meet modern standards of characterization and consistency, critics have argued, is to misunderstand what Shakespeare and his audience might well have been looking for. Rather than read like this, looking for coherence and ideology, suggests Zach Jackson, we'd be wise to read Joan topically, as consistent with her immediate surroundings and the action of any given moment. Now, Jackson's reading of the play is, in my opinion, brilliant. Any critic who wishes to resuscitate Joan in 1 Henry VI owes her an immeasurable debt. However, while I agree with her that we should be rethinking how we read Joan, I want to suggest we look at Joan not as topically consistent tonight, but as emblematic of Shakespeare as a poet of ambivalence. 1 Henry VI is a play about the succession of kings, about the bloody business of what happens when a monarch is ill-fit for the crown. If Henry V is the story of what great rulers do when the situation calls for greatness, Henry VI is the story of how poor rulers can undo the work of their forebears. At the beginning of 1 Henry VI, we find England unsettled by the death of her greatest king. While Henry V had won great victories for England in his time on the throne, that time had proven all too brief. Following his untimely death, the throne fell to Henry VI, and as Shakespeare imagines him, Henry VI is a weak-willed king at a time when England can nary afford such a thing. The country is under siege from old enemies, emboldened by the death of the great king, and Henry lacks the knowledge, the will, and the ability to deal with such issues, and certainly lacks the ability to deal with Joan. Unsurprisingly then, Joan gets the better of the English for much of the play, even laying low the champion Talbot and his son. For 4 acts, the play is a meditation on a dark chapter in English history, a reminder of a time when glory that had been hard won was lost by the successor of a great man. And if we read the play, as generations of critics have, then the turn to a demonic Joan in Act 5 would indeed be perplexing. We don't need the intercession of demons to explain why things were the way they were. But if we're willing to see the play differently, as an exercise perhaps in ambivalence, then something else appears. If we see the play this way, And the transformation of Joan in Act 5 makes complete and total sense. Well, Shakespeare spent much of the play mining the historical record found in the Chronicles from which he so liberally drew. In Act 5, he makes it clear that such things are not a matter of simple history. When Shakespeare's Joan first consorts with fiends in Act 5, Scene 3, and then claims benefit of belly in Act 5, Scene 4, which is the right to forestall her own execution on the grounds that she's pregnant, she becomes for Shakespeare the icon of a much more modern Catholic threat than that of historical counterpart. In these moments, any pretense of Joan's virtue is swept away, and her threat and duplicitousness are brought to the fore. She's not merely a young French girl as in Howland Hall. She's the reminder that Catholics are not to be trusted, that they are the whore of Babylon, whose form, perhaps at first alluring, is always only the cover for reality that is much more protean and Gordian. As a practicing Catholic, my students would tell you that's exactly how I am. That seemed nice at first, and then I break things. And begging for her life in Act 5, Scene 4, Joan, who here enacts a three-time denial of her shepherd father, sound familiar, becomes a cipher for what many in Shakespeare's audience would have seen as the Antichrist, the Pope. She is the reminder that Catholic Spain had just attempted to conquer England, and that even at this very moment, other Catholic groups, most pointedly Jesuits like Parsons, were still threatening to overthrow the nation. She is, in short, the reminder that England is always in danger, and that such a danger is all the more pointed at times when succession is in question. And where in 106 England came close to disaster with the loss of Talbot, in the present it might not get off so easily. Now, if we're to stop here, we might be drawn to return to the belief that Shakespeare can be read as an ideologue. After all, isn't the message I've been sketching out one of a national poet warning of the danger of Catholics? Of course, it's never so easy to pin down Shakespeare. And there's another surprise left in store for his audience. Despite her best efforts, Joan is executed for crimes against England. She is, like so many others in the 16th century, burned at the stake. And that's the rub. Joan's punishment, while historically accurate, was also somewhat ironic. Despite the fact that more than 4,000 people are burned at the stake in England for heresy between 1547 and 1600, there is little to no evidence that this deterred anyone. If anything, such public executions did more to make martyrs than examples. Further, even history tells us that the censure of Joan by fire did little to stave off the ills of a poor ruler, as it would take the War of the Roses to right that ship. Here, Shakespeare is at his ambivalent best. Just moments after we see him turn history into the present in a way that rallies those in the audience, he reminds us that the actions we will take to secure peace are probably going to backfire. Now, while I've been focusing here on 1 Henry VI, this was hardly the only play in which Shakespeare engaged the religious other in ways that revealed him to be what I have called a brief and abstract chronicle, and not, as we so often want him to be, a champion for a given cause. Like 1 Henry VI, Titus Andronicus, or if you've not seen it, Quentin Tarantino does Shakespeare, has long been one of Shakespeare's maligned plays. Likely first performed in 1591 or 92, right around the time of Henry, Titus is something of a mix of adaptation and homage of Seneca's Thyestes. Even for audiences that have grown accustomed to the high body count of plays like King Lear, the sheer brutality of Titus Andronicus is shocking. It's a play in which revenge is literally a dish best served cold. Oh. Is that too much? Perfect. Given the violence and brutality of the play, it's perhaps unsurprising that audiences used to seeing Shakespeare as high culture, the so-called blue hairs, as seen as the swan of Avon, reject the play. However, equally perturbing to the violence for critics, is the character of Aaron the Moor. Seen by some as an imperfect precursor to Iago, the famous antagonist of Othello, Aaron is dismissed as being too horrible to be believable, and the product of an inexperienced playwright trying his hand at complex ideas he would only master much later in his career. This distaste for Aaron is most palpable in reactions to his famous, or perhaps infamous, speech near the end of the play. Having been revealed as a mastermind of a series of horrors, including rape, mutilation, and murder, Aaron is asked to repent for his sins. But instead of doing so, he says his only regret is that he did not do more. Once again, if we read Aaron in light of our own modern tastes and desires, he seems incomprehensible. However, if we read him as the product of an author trying to engage an audience, Aaron, like Joan, becomes emblematic of ambivalence. Read this way, Aaron becomes a meditation on the fear, especially after the Battle of Lepanto in 1572, that the Turk or the Moor will invade England by force or phallus. And, as we saw with Joan, the sphere is once again linked to concerns about the vulnerability of a nation with an uncertain plan for succession. And, just like with Joan, the final punishment that is meant to censure Aaron is particularly ineffective, as the only thing left functioning when he is buried up to his chest is his mouth, the very instrument of his wrath and malice. Now, when we're rolled enough in time, we can continue at this point to talk about similar concerns in 1 Henry IV, or The Merchant of Venice, or anything written in the 1590s. However, time is a finite resource, and I want to take a moment to channel my inner puck, my inner chorus, and provide something of an epilogue here. The theme for this evening is Shakespeare's Mythologies, the stories he crafted that explain his world in a way that reveal his ambivalence about the issues on which we so often want him to speak with authority, that authority we try to give him when he so routinely claims. My hope is that we can unpack this in 2 ways. First, in looking at Shakespeare's construction of the religious other, more pointedly Joan, in ways that both spoke to and challenged his audience, and thereby used her as a tool for deconstructing the issues facing a nation preoccupied with the succession of an aging monarch. Second, and I think just as importantly, by chipping away at our own view of Shakespeare as tacitly created in our own image, and suggesting we might be better to see him as an artist working for the rent instead. And that brings us back to the joke that began. Why do we all laugh? Why do we all get it? Because we know Shakespeare's not the Earl of Oxford. We know who he is. Shakespeare's this creation of our own, right? He believes like I believe. He wants what I want. Maybe not so much, right? Maybe not without merit, but not without mustard. Thank you.